Trump is weighing a military strike on Iran, with multiple outlets reporting that the U.S. military would be ready for potential action as soon as today. The Wall Street Journal reports that the U.S. has gathered, quote, the most air power in the Mideast since the 2003 Iraq invasion. And the Journal is reporting that Trump is weighing an initial limited strike to force Iran into a nuclear deal. Trump has confirmed that a limited strike is among the options.
I guess I can say I am considering it.
He also was given a timeline to the theocratic regime.
Well, we're going to make a deal, or we're going to get a deal one way or the other.
And you essentially 10 days. Give them a deadline firm to make a deal?
I would think that would be enough time, 10, 15 days, pretty much maximum.
Now, remember this is important. It's worth recalling that Trump deployed a timeline on Iran last June when he was weighing a strike on the nuclear sites. The commander-in-chief had this message on Thursday, June 19th.
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks.
But just 2 days later, Trump struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites with 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs in an operation dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer. As the Associated Press noted, the initial Thursday communication was a, quote, last-minute misdirection meant to give the operation a powerful element of surprise. So will President Trump strike Iran as soon as today, or will diplomacy persist? Who better to ask than Fox News senior strategic analyst General Jack Keane. General Keane, I want to pull up a map of Iran right now. And in this map that we've created, what you see are all of the various elements of the, quote, armada that President Trump has talked about: aircraft carriers, destroyers, support, air bases, and beyond. What does this map say to you about the imminency of this attack?
Well, certainly we're preparing, for quite a significant air campaign here. I mean, the operation would be limited by the sense that we're not doing a ground operation to change the regime out. We're going to use a quite significant air campaign. That means airplanes as well as missiles to set the conditions for a regime change. And that's what you see unfolding on your map there. And there's 2 purposes for that armada to be there. One is to conduct an offensive operation that would be comprehensive in the sense of civilian and military leaders, the entire infrastructure that sustains the regime, from the IRGC to the repressive elements of the Basile militia that represses the people, the police themselves, and the ballistic missile program, their short-range rockets, and the thousands of drones that they have. And whatever intent they have about recovering their nuclear program would certainly be on that list. But the second piece, and is an important piece, is the defensive operation, because Iran has the ability to retaliate. They're in the most vulnerable, fragile position they have been. President Trump did not have this opportunity a year ago, until such time as the Prime Minister Netanyahu and he conducted the 12-day operation where President Trump obviously did the decisive takedown of their nuclear enterprise. And as a result of that 12-day war, Iran is very fragile and vulnerable when you add to it the fact that their entire economy is in the tank, and that's why the people were demonstrating. So the strategic opportunity here is huge in terms of setting the conditions for a regime change. Let's say we did nothing. Let's say we're going to leave the status quo here. What happens then? Well, if we do nothing, Iran begins to recover. They'll continue to support the proxies. They'll rebuild their ballistic missile program, which they've been doing since June, by the way. They'll attempt to recover their nuclear enterprise, and things will just go back to normal. For the last 46 years, Iran has destabilized the Middle East. They have been an aggressor. And what we have here, Kayleigh, is an opportunity for an enduring peace. And yes, we have to use military force to achieve that end. That is the preferred option, I think, that's really on the table here.
And we know the Wall Street Journal was reporting a limited strike was under consideration. The president confirmed that. Do you think assassination of the Iranian leadership could be something that's being considered?
I think civil and military leadership would be on the table, absolutely. We hold these people accountable for the horror that they have inflicted on the people, for what they have done in supporting the October 7th attack against Israel. They have killed fairly close to the amount of Americans from 1982, when they dropped 2 embassies and the Marine barracks, and continued to kill us over the next 46 years, pretty close to the kind of numbers we had on 9/11 as a result of al-Qaeda. And that is why the president took out Qasem Soleimani, because Secretary Pompeo, then the Secretary of State, laid out the entire history of Iran killing Americans. And the question was asked by the president, well, why haven't we done something about this sooner? And the reason is because people fear the adverse consequences. And there's people right now that are suggesting to the president, don't do this. There's they could retaliate. Of course they can retaliate, but we can reduce that retaliation to a minimum. There's always some adverse consequences that an enemy has, but it doesn't mean that you don't take action. You don't let those adverse consequences paralyze you out of fear of doing something that really would be Trump's defining foreign policy legacy, in my view. If we take Iran off the board, which we have an opportunity to set the conditions for, that would be a strategic win that all previous 7 presidents never were able to achieve something like that.
Yep, and President Trump silenced the critics after Fordo. He silenced the critics after Maduro. He might just silence the critics again. General Jack Keane, thank you.
Hey, it's Will Keane. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Keane podcast for full episodes right now.